Hello, everybody. This is an interview I did with an independent Australian journalist. The interview didn't go exactly the way I wanted to. Usually, I like to do a candid, personal, kind of like raw, genuine interview with people. That's my style. The interviewee wanted to be more distant and non personal and attempting objectivity more. I was a little frustrated because the whole reason I wanted to do the interview was I wanted a personal opinion on what happened on the ground. But I thought about not releasing it, but I think there's enough good information in this to put it out anyways. Hope you guys like it. If there are anybody else from Australia or South Africa or England that are watching this, please reach out to me if you'd be willing to be interviewed. I want to hear on what's going on the ground in other places or anywhere else in the world. Canada, South America, basically anywhere. If you're experiencing some extreme situations from COVID lockdowns, I would like to hear from you on the ground. I'll put you out in your opinion unedited, and let the world see what you are seeing. You can reach out to me at thevillainreport@gmail.com. Thevillainreport@gmail.com. And here we go. Hope you enjoy the interview.
Hey everybody, this is the Villain Report. This is my first podcast interview. I've got the lucky chance to have a independent journalist with some amazing footage and high production quality that I've seen so far. His name is Chriscoveries. Chriscoveries. You spell that C-H-R-I-S. Chriscoveries.
Coveries.
C-H-R-I-S-C-O-V-R. Yes. You say it. I was telling on my live stream the other day, I have a really hard time spelling things when I'm not looking at them. So you go ahead and you tell us your platform.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Chriscoveries. I'm thinking of a channel to use, and I just thought a portmanteau of Chris and Discoveries. That'll do. And it's just stuck since. And yeah, it's great to be speaking with someone else who does a similar job to me. It's amazing. There's not many of us. So thank you.
Can
And I'm
you?
really so glad we connected.
I'm glad to have you on here. I've had a couple of conversations with Chris so far. Can you spell your Chriscoveries for us?
Or Chriscoveries.
All right,
Chriscoveries. Um,
Chris like Discoveries, but it's Chris instead of the D. So Chriscoveries. All right. So what we're going to be talking about in this interview is Chris has been on the ground in Australia. He lives there. You're in or around Sydney, is that correct?
our biggest city.
And his beat recently has been to go cover the lockdown protests, and he's got firsthand knowledge on all these scary things we're seeing coming out of Australia and the US. It's really hard for me, and I think a lot of people, to know what's true anymore because we're seeing so much mainstream media lie, and you see people making up viral videos that are just completely fabricated and they're not in touch with reality, or people will take real video, but then they'll give a different story about it. So we'd like to see what's really going on in Australia. I've been seeing police beating the snot out of people at protests, excessive violence. I've been hearing things that you guys are all locked down in your houses for 21, 22, 23 hours a day, that you're not allowed to leave for more than a couple kilometers from your house, that everybody's subject to arrest. I'm hearing that there's COVID camps, very sprawling camps being built, and people are being interned there for travel reasons and for infection reasons. But I guess I'll I'll open the floor up to you to just let you broadly say what you're experiencing there, and then I will ask you questions to clarify and to go from there. So what is happening in Australia? What's going on with the COVID lockdowns over there?
You know, when you're used to something, it's just normal. It's not something abnormal. I look at what happens in America and go, no, no, that's the weird one, because our second biggest city is coming up on 230 days of stay-at-home restrictions, and these aren't light stay-at-home restrictions of you can't go to a big stadium or you can't have a dance party. They are you cannot go to the park. They're taped off. You cannot leave home without a reasonable excuse. And for half of those days, you cannot go to work. Do not go to work. Only certain essential workers are allowed to go to work. But for us, this is normal now. After hundreds of days, how could it be anything different? So the visceral reaction that I see it provoking in a lot of Americans of how can this possibly be, for a lot of Australians, is not just normal. but many Australians are clamoring for more restrictions, a lockdown to zero. And there's a lot of people who want that. So I don't know what to tell you in terms of how we're reacting to it, but we wouldn't be having such violent and sporadic protests if there wasn't some division as to what we should do.
What do you mean by half of the days you weren't allowed to go to work? Does that happen halfway through this lockdown, or are you limited on the hours you're allowed to work? What did you mean by that?
So for about 140 or 150 days in Melbourne, you do not go to work. Let's say you have a job in construction, do not go to work. Let's say you have a job in banking, do not go to work. Unless you can work from home, do not go to work, except if you are a nurse, grocery store worker, a specific list of workers, which unlike other places, this is quite strict. So yeah, do not go to work.
Wow. In our private conversations before this, we had discussed how you're getting grocery deliveries to your house. Is that part of the lockdowns, or is that just a luxury that you partake in outside of the lockdowns, or are people encouraged not to go to the grocery store at all?
Absolutely. In our morning press conferences that we have with our state leaders, one of the discussions last week was whether unvaccinated people would be permitted to go to grocery stores. That's one of the debates that we're kind of trying to navigate, is whether you'll be allowed to leave your home for food and other grocery supplies if you have not been vaccinated. And it's a real debate. A lot of people believe that unvaccinated people should be under permanent house arrest, and others believe that unvaccinated people should be allowed to leave their homes. We don't know where we're at with that. We're navigating that one, but we haven't instituted that restriction yet. We were a bit ahead of the curve in terms of grocery delivery technologically compared to America. So we've had grocery delivery for quite a few years, but now it's become a necessity. And the delays for getting grocery deliveries can sometimes be 7 to 8 days. So you've got to plan ahead for milk and perishables and things like that. And you can only have one order stacked up in a queue. And people are getting angry about that because it's hard to keep a household going with a 6-day delay between when you order something and get it. Then you have the restriction of, if you want to go to the supermarket, only one person from each household can leave to go and shop at one store for 1 hour per day. And it's hard to run a household around that. So yeah, but again, for most Australians, this is normal.
So is it 22-hour lockdown, or what's the details on that?
Certain parts of Sydney have a curfew. So even with, if you are an essential worker and work in some parts of construction, even if you were going to the supermarket, even if you have all these other list of restrictions, and even if you can leave your house for exercise for 1 hour per day, you still must return to your home in about half of Sydney, about 2.5-3 million people, for before 9 p.m. And there is no reasonable excuse to leave home. And that is what we're always taught when we're leaving home. And it's been for months now. You must have a reasonable excuse to leave home. And there are 4 reasons for doing that. One is work, which is better than Melbourne. In Melbourne, you don't leave home for work unless you're a nurse or other firefighter, things like that. So we can leave home for work in Sydney. Hey, liberty. Second is if it's for grocery shopping or otherwise buying goods and services, medical care, or compassionate care for someone otherwise can't. You don't go into other people's homes, so we're told you don't go into other people's homes and what have you. And yeah, look, we're still living as I think much of America did last April and May, and that's a good comparison. We've just kept living that way.
Why? Why? What's going on over there? What you said that many people are asking for more and greater lockdowns. What's happening in Australia what's happening? What is this?
It takes someone who doesn't live here to ask the obvious question: why? We weren't vaccinated. and you jump to the medical term. But the explanation I have for you is that for 9 months of this, we had eliminated COVID, 0 cases for almost a year, and then Delta slipped through the net. So we were living as Americans through your January peak and your last summer and all of that. We had 0 cases, nothing. It was a problem over there for the others. And now we're dealing with everyone else with. So we didn't go through the wrenching social period. We were not vaccinated against the societal impacts of the virus. So we're completely now unprepared over the past 8-9 weeks of trying to work out, what do we do with this? How do we approach this? Now we're confused and we're angry and we're looking for someone to blame. And the politicians in their hearings of how this got out say, oh, I can't recall. Hundreds of times it was recorded that the politicians saying, I can't recall. No one was to blame for anything anywhere about this. No one's head rolled in their job. And it's not to blame for China. We can't blame China because that would be politically incorrect. So it's not China either. We can't explain why it was easier to fly from Wuhan to Sydney than it was Wuhan to Shanghai. So we don't talk about that. We can't explain that it might be because of some areas of Sydney spread the virus more than others. And it's some kind of demographic, societal, geographic, any other reason like that. We don't talk about that either. We're hunting for someone to blame, and we're trying to make someone pay, and inevitably we want everyone else to pay because we're suffering as well. I don't have a good answer as to why, and I don't think most of us do either.
So you personally, I know we're jumping around here. I'm trying to grab all these puzzle pieces and hopefully they'll coalesce all at the end. You personally are having groceries delivered to your house.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a personal choice for yourself? Is that a luxury? Are you trying to avoid going out in public? Why are you having grocery delivery?
If I want to leave to go and get groceries, first I'll need to be wearing a mask when I leave my home. If you're seen outside your home without a mask, that can lead to a conversation with an officer that you just who wants unneeded police interactions. And in some areas of Sydney, you'll need to have one on while you're driving your car. So then even then you'll need to have, I think pretty much at all times, have a mask with you. We've got new laws about stop and identification, so you can be stopped by a police officer, and if you don't have a form of photo identification, you can be detained for as long as the police need to. Standard stop and identify, New York style. Then when you get there, you'll need to check in with an app on your phone and record your attendance to it. And when you do get to the stores, for anyone who can remember what people were like before this virus, it is a chilling and cold reminder of how much has changed when, not just when you're wearing masks, but any interaction. Does anyone remember having a brief conversation with the person at the checkout and having a, hey, how you going? What's happening? Oh, you good? What's going on? There's none of that. You complete your checkout in complete silence. And if you do speak, it's regarded with a certain disdain. And it's chilling and uncomfortable to go through the process, to go through the checkout, and to be and here's the other thing: if you pick up something off the shelf, it's unapproved to put it back, and that's a natural response. Like, oh, what's in the ingredients of this? Let's have it's like chess. You touch it, you bought it, and so if you do put it back, other people in the store like, all of it is a really unpleasant experience. So is that a personal choice? Sure, yeah, because the alternative is much worse. Much worse. I'd prefer remembering that the outside world was just as I remember it. I think you might too.
Yeah. Things are somewhat getting back to normal in the U.S. in certain parts of the U.S. There are states reinstituting mask mandates at certain levels, and but it's nowhere near what you're describing over there. What about this COVID app that I've been reading about? I've heard things that it's got GPS location in it and that it's got facial recognition. I've heard that you have to check in with it every 15 minutes and show your face so they can prove where you are. What's the truth about that?
So for one, that app which you're talking about is only for people returning from overseas. And we have hotels which we'd put them in put the people who were returning from overseas in. But that was complex because time and again the virus kept escaping from them, and we didn't build specialist quarantine camps because we just never got around to it. We had them from decades gone by, but we just never recommissioned them. So we put them in these city luxury hotels, and inevitably the virus kept getting out. So in South Australia, what they instituted was an app-based tool where they could poll you, and at one time they could use a facial recognition app and a geolocation to ensure that you are at home, like with a bit of a video call. It's confronting, but it could, for some people, be a better alternative to have that than be locked in a hotel for 2 weeks. A windowless, airless, prison food hotel. It's pretty unpleasant. Could it be a better alternative? It's certainly confronting, and the slippery slope of privacy invasions, well, we're seeing that just continue. Is it better than the alternative? We're still navigating that.
So you speak of the privacy invasions. I believe I spoke to you about this, and I've read about it a lot, that the Australian government has the right to take over your social media and not only just take control of it, but actually make posts on your account on your behalf. Is that true?
Last week that did come in. That was a new law that did come in, and it passed with support of our two major parties. And that's just law now. It had been coming for a while. And our security services, like yours in the US, have said that one half of their time is dedicated to investigating far-right extremism, which the anti-lockdown, anti-vax, freedom, liberty, whatever you want to call the broad anti-lockdown movement, has been put in the far-right bag, and is seen as a far-right movement. And that's because a lot of, just as BLM Antifa formed a odd alliance, as some of the white nationalists, white separatists, white supremacists, neo-Nazi kind of grab bag of, there's been overlap in the members. So the federal agencies have been struggling to work out what it is, but it's very hard for large organizations, intelligence agencies, to find nuance in these groups. So it just becomes a broad far right team, you're assigned to this, and that he's gone on television saying half of our intelligence services are dedicated to investigating domestic far right extremism, of which anti-lockdown is a part of. Look, it's a concern that such a movement ties up so much. I haven't seen the radical, bomb-making, armed, planned. We had a problem with radical Islamic extremism for a time. We had some attacks and a siege where a man with an ISIS flag took between 15 and 20 people hostage, killed. It was quite a drama, and we went through a period of concern about Islamic extremism. So it's alarming that we're putting that much energy into that. Maybe there's good reason for it. Again, I don't work for our security services, but it does, as someone who follows extremism, protest is my job. It does surprise me that there's so much depth to that, and maybe it's just something I haven't seen. But we'll see over the next year whether that's so.
So the Australian government equates white supremacy with reluctance to comply to vaccine mandates.
Yeah, that's true. I believe increasingly your agencies are tending towards the same as well. Certainly in the UK and Europe, there's a bit of an overlap, but it's just seemed to be the same thing. That far right libertarian kind of mindset. It's just how it is.
Tell me more about these quarantine camps. You said that they've been in place in Australia for decades.
Yeah, so we years ago, through the 1920s, just as you had your Ellis Island and assessing people for infectious diseases, we had our Neutral Bay, which performed a similar task. And my private expectation is when we needed to quarantine people, we just dust off these outdoor cabins and drop down some 20-foot containers and off you go. But we didn't. We kept putting them up in inner city, high-rise luxury hotels, which for virus control of most of the experts I spoke to just didn't really make sense. But it makes great sense from a business perspective. If you have hotels which no one's going to, how do you keep them afloat without delivering buckets of money to them? Turn them into government mandated quarantine hotels. So if you come to Australia, it doesn't matter whether you've been tested, vaccinated, we don't care, into a hotel for 2 weeks, and we're going to test you until you're negative. Because again, we went through a COVID zero period for about a year, kind of. But that has now come to an end.
I've seen viral videos of these little rows and rows of little tiny houses. And one video, a man was describing a woman sitting on her porch at this tiny house having tea, and the police came by and told her to put her mask on. And is that a real situation, or?
Yes. Yep. That's the most apparent, but there's plenty of stories like them, plenty of Facebooks where people talk about their experiences inside. That is real, yes, and yeah, that's our new normal.
It's just, so are Australians just terrified that there's a worldwide plague that's going to kill them, or why is everybody allowing the government to take this much control over their life?
So in terms of the politics of it, I'd say approximately a third of Australia believes not enough is being done, and that this doesn't go far enough. I'd say a third of Australia wants far more, way more than this, and demands and clamours for more action to be done. I would suggest about another, opposite 25% believes this is just a complete overreaction to a virus that is not as deadly as some fear. And then there's the middle third, 40%, which just is completely overwhelmed and will go with whatever way seems to be the tide going at the time. For a time, the freedom movement was gaining traction. Their protests were getting larger, and thousands were marching through the city peacefully, calmly. Then Delta hit, restrictions came in, and they were told you cannot have protests, and that was the end of that. That was the end of that.
Does Australia have anything comparable to the U.S.'s Bill of Rights, or the amendments to the Constitution that says these rights shall not be taken away? It doesn't sound like you have freedom of speech. It doesn't sound like you have a freedom of self-defense. You don't have freedom of assembly, obviously. You're just at the law of the quote-unquote king of Australia, to be facetious.
Your earliest constitutional texts are very difficult to usurp. We didn't have something quite like that. Our laws came from British law in 1901, and any appeals at the highest level of appeal up until 86 was 1986, which isn't that long ago, was to the Privy Council in London. So your Supreme Court was our Privy Council in London, or up until really not that long ago. That was changed not that recently. So it's more malleable to change the way Australia works than it is America. That said, your country is changing rapidly too. But to change some of those very clear English language lines in your Bill of Rights, we don't have that. We have much longer descriptions, laws that can be overwritten, and the devil's in the detail. A 1,000 point Declaration of Human Rights from the UN is not the same as your Bill of Rights. We don't have those same freedoms. A great one that you may not know is Australians cannot leave Australia without permission. If I wanted to fly to your country right now, I would be denied. I'd need to explain my reason for travel, that it would be a permanent departure, or I'd be for compassionate care, such as attending to my brother's death, and it would be reviewed. And I did apply last year, and I was rejected, and there was a High Court appeal over my application, and the conclusion of that High Court appeal, this is our highest court in the land, the conclusion of that, was that, yes, Australians do have the freedom to leave their country, but those freedoms granted as part of that section are not absolute, and that Parliament and the executive power, our Prime Minister, can exempt in certain situations those freedoms. So yeah, you can do that, but not all the time, and not if we decide not to.
Oh, Australia is sounding more and more scary to me as I talk to you. Sounds like a prison.
For people who are in prison, you're used to it. You only know you're in a prison if you're told it. And we're not told we're in a prison. Does that make we don't you don't know you're in a cage unless you're told something different. We we don't increasingly we don't see what's happening around the world. Most of our news is just tied up with case count numbers. And you remember how you had the weatherman? We had the vax man. So we had the man who comes up and he explains how many vaccines we've delivered for the day and how many cases, and then he'll turn back to the anchor and hand back over. So we've got a dedicated news sections just for COVID. Sportsman, weatherman, vaxman, and that's just it really is a new normal. The freedoms that Americans are looking at, I see some of your sports games, would be revolting to most Australians. I would say most, I would say 51% would find that level of social gathering absolutely revolting. I can't underwrite enough how much it has become a new normal, and it's just how it is. Life goes on.
Since we're talking about freedoms, most Americans, when they think about freedom in Australia, they think about the guns. So, as I understand it, you are able to own a rifle.
You can apply for firearms licenses. That's true. And when you apply for a firearms license, you need to be someone of good character, and you need to attend a training course, and which they'll show you how a rifle works, and you need to demonstrate that you can show how a bolt-action rifle works. That takes about 3 or 4 hours. Then you'll need to apply for a permit to acquire a specific type of weapon, and not pistol. Long arms, category A and B is much easier to get, so then you can apply to get that. Then you go to the store with your permit to acquire that's been approved by the firearms agency, and then you can purchase that rifle. You hand that over, and they register that you have purchased this weapon, and that's then in your custody. Then whenever you're moving your weapons anywhere, you must travel from safe storage location to safe storage location, from the gun shop to your home, where you have a safe that meets very specific requirements: types of bolts, what it's bolted to, the amount of concrete underneath it or type of wood that it's bolted to, the lock type, the thickness of the steel, who knows where the keys are, how many keys you have, who has access to the property, all of these things. And there will be inspections of the safe, of your safe storage location. And when you take your guns out, when you're going to, let's say, the range, you do not stop for fuel. You do not, unless absolutely necessary, you do not stop for snacks. You must always be in visual distance of where the weapon is. You must, and you go from point to point. You cannot hand your weapon to someone who does not have a firearms license. And if anyone does, culpable to you. You must have a locked ammunition container if you're going to carry ammunition with you. Generally, it's easier if you just buy ammunition at the range of where you're going to use it. This is just some of the regulations around it. Does it mean we have fewer firearms deaths? Absolutely. There's always trade-offs no matter what it is. There's a brief insight in how we deal with our guns.
So what are the allowable reasons to purchase and own a gun?
Target shooting, hunting, sports. Yep, those are the main ones. The whole security industry I won't go into because that's something else. But for personal use, those are the only applicable reasons, and tend to be small caliber, bolt action, or lever action. Semi-automatic is only for very, very particular types of persons, and even then, semi-automatic 22. Anything bigger caliber than that would be a white class. There's these levels of investigation that need to go into your character, your reason for use, and it's mainly just for security use, and that's just very unusual, only for foreign dignitaries and the like. You can't just go buy a gun.
So why do we as Americans have such an image of Australians not being able to own guns? And I believe in the late 90s, we're told that you got all your guns taken away, or that you gave them away.
Have you noticed your politics is a little bit divided? And that the most extreme voices
I want to try
are the
to get down
loudest.
to like the conversation is not going as well and flowing as I'd like. If we can, I'd like to get more of a personal, like flowing back and forth. So Americans see Australia as not being able to own guns, but you're saying that that's not true. It's very strict, but we are under the impression that you can't own guns in Australia, and we see pictures of like dump trucks full of guns from the late 90s, and all the guns were given away to the government. You willfully gave them away. Is there any truth to that, or is that just propaganda? Was there an event that happened to where most of the guns were taken away?
It's how can I best put it? 1996, we had a mass murder event, and that was where we went from. I wouldn't quite say an American style a way of owning guns, but it was a, how can I best describe it? It was much more liberalized than what it was, and that's where we instituted the current rules of what we have. So you have to have firearms licenses, got rid of semi-automatics, and it changed things radically. You can still acquire firearms, but it's strictly regulated. And did they take guns away? Yes, we sold back millions of them. It cost, I'm not sure of the amount, but I think close on $1 billion in today's money to buy back all of these weapons. So it's how can I put it? Yes, we did give back our guns. We still can have them, but the amount of rules and openness that happens in the US, we just don't have. We did see almost $1 billion of guns sold back to the government, and it's never been the same since.
If the situation with guns in Australia is so intense and so strict, and there's so much bureaucratic tape to go through to own a gun, and even just simple guns. Many people will be familiar with the incident at Christchurch and the Christchurch shooter. How did he obtain all those high-powered semi-automatic weapons? Like I'm not. He might have even had automatic weapons.
New Zealand had much more liberal gun laws than Australia.
Oh, he's in New Zealand. Okay, we are
New Zealand.
America. We confuse those two. I don't know if you guys think of Canada and America as the U.S. is similar, but often Americans get. I know I do. I confuse New Zealand and Australia sometimes. So that's a different country. Okay.
He was able to purchase a semi-automatic weapon, which here is just really, really unusual.
Okay. All right, so let's get back to the lockdown stuff that's going on over there. You've been out kind of doing the same thing that I've been trying to do. Like you've got much higher production quality than I do, and professionalism. I go out there and kind of just act like a yokel and just put myself into the fray of it. But I've been watching some of your footage, and tell us about that. What are you seeing on the ground at these anti-mandate protests?
Villain, you're too kind. I'm looking forward to our next conversation. I would ask you about your coverage, but if I can screen share some of what we've been seeing here, if I may.
All right.
So, what we've been seeing here has. Give me 1 second. What we've been seeing here has been it's been a year now. It's been almost a year of not just protests, but there we go. Of not just protests, but increasingly dissatisfaction with what began as hesitancy around the lockdowns is now hesitancy around authority in total. You've probably seen some of the protests in the UK and what have you, but these are now escalating way more out of control into something that is becoming increasingly violent, anti-media, anti-authoritarian. Even here, that's me getting my gear broken. Just this week, there was an event on Tuesday where across 70 different government offices across Sydney, 150 people were arrested while they were just kneeling outside of them. It's shocking the sheer volume of resistance that seems to be happening, and you can see the number of people who do show up. The police response has been equally strong as well, because they are terrified of your Portland, Minneapolis style riots happening here, because once one window gets broken, it opens up to the next one. It's escalating, and you still have those third that looks at these people and calls them plague rats, and the other quarter to a third who looks at these people and calls them freedom fighters, and an exhausted middle that doesn't know what to make of it all. This is confrontational. This does get violent. And part of my coverage is I try to show that not all cops are bastards and not all protesters are peaceful. And it's in the middle we're going to try and discover some truth around it. Because in these long live streams, I can't edit out what I don't like. And that's the one thing that unifies these protesters more than anything else, is hate and dislike of the media.
Are you seeing a lot of police brutality at these things?
Some. Compared to Melbourne, which is our second city, Sydney is doing brilliantly. In Melbourne, you're seeing from the get-go, people, even a year ago, officers being deployed in hard gear, which tells protesters the police are there for business, not to chat. And that will get exactly the response. And that's one of the in policing you have, is that if you show up in hard gear, you're going to get a hard response. Just as if protesters show up throwing bottles, you're going to get a hard response. Thankfully, in Sydney, someone up there in command has been holding back and saying, let's not deploy that straight away. Let's hold the horses back and then escalate our response through. In Melbourne, though, widespread use of irritants, and even a couple of weeks ago, the deployment of rubber bullets, which leave huge welts on people's chests and are less lethal, which some people say, oh, it's less lethal. Less lethal. We haven't seen that here. We've seen small displays of pepper spray, some horse units being deployed, but we've been a lot better. But Melbourne, it's pretty sad what's happening down there. It's sad.
Wow.
If I can keep going, if I may, I'll show you a bit more of the footage, if I can, from a year ago, because what I tried to show people was that in between your protests was that I tried to create a short film between your Portland, Minneapolis style anarchy and our strong police response to protests. There had to be some kind of middle ground, because I don't want my city to fall into that kind of anarchy. I don't think you're living in Portland. You do either, and I'm hoping to go into that with you in another episode where I ask you everything about what's happening there. But at the same time, the level of lockdowns I can really sense from you, and in our conversations as well, is terrifying to most Americans that we have here. Somewhere in the middle, there must be something where we're just letting two groups of people violently go at it, and on the other side, you can't leave your home for any reason and can't even have a silent protest. There's got to be something in the middle of that.
Yeah. You don't strike me as being upset by what's happening too well. You just seem to you described it as things change and things are different now. But if I was being locked in my house, when's the last time So for 230 days, you've been pretty much in your house with your family by your outside of the world.
Melbourne was that. We were a little bit less, but 140 something. It's been a while. Um, from my job to report the news of what's happening, I'm not going to get where I'm going by getting angry about it, and I've kind of accepted that. Um, and a lot of other Australians have as well. I think a lot of other Australians just have thrown their arms up and say, "What can you do in that sensible centre?" Um, Look, it's not my rage isn't going to change a thing about it. What might change it is by simply and honestly reporting what's happening out there, um, and doing the best I can there. Uh, a story that your viewers might like, an anecdotal story of mine, is going for a walk in the park one evening at about 9 p.m. at night. See a neighbor, say hello, go over and speak with him, and within seconds, I'm stopped by a undercover police car that's driven up next to us and is asking what our reasonable excuse to be out of home is, because outdoor recreation is not an excuse. You must be exercising, and to be exercising, you need to be moving. So keep walking. What is my visceral reaction going to be doing with that? If I start getting in the officer's face and say, "What are you doing? This is," it's not going to change a thing. The Australian people want these rules and want more of it. My anger isn't going to change that.
Where do you stand? What do you want?
What good is wealth that you cannot spend? We in Australia are obsessed with property prices, income, as everyone else is. Money matters a great deal. But what good is $100 bill that you can't leave your home to use? What good is $1 million asset that you can't liquefy and gain the benefit of? Much of the purpose of life is to enjoy some part of it. On the flip side of it, there's the risk of the virus that stops you from enjoying any life at all, from dying early of it. We must be able to navigate somewhere in the middle. Where I stand is neither extreme. I neither believe that the virus should be just let rip and unvaccinated people should be running around kissing people in the streets and wildly spreading. I don't know whatever the extreme of their 5G. On the other side, locking down to zero seems absurd. It would be something that may take years, and the amount of self-harm and suicide and enormous economic costs would be more than the basis of it. I was early on with the coronavirus panic of sorts, all the way back in January of 2020. And my expectation was that in a few months, we'd just pack up and say, "Okay, everyone, church is outside now." And we all go, "Oh, okay." And we all just do things outside. And, "Oh, hey, everyone, school is outside." And we set up these big tents so that air could flow through and everything and it not be as closed in. "Okay, school's outside now." And we just kind of cheerily get on with it. I didn't expect the amount of wooden sticks we had for our fellow people, the amount of shouting and decrying and the social breakdown. If it's any indicator for other places around the world, maybe this is just a taste of what's yet to come.
So what do you want personally?
First and foremost, to be able to continue reporting protests. I love going to protests, a little bit like you. I'm hoping we speak about this because this is very interesting. But what I want is to be able to continue going to protests and being able to cover them. Because one thing that I think we failed more than vaccine response, virus, anything. I'm not a doctor. I don't want to get media. How we share what's happening. And I think my experience of last week being told that I'm not a journalist, I need to go home and I'm going to risk being fined or what have you, was a great reminder that even after 2 years of covering these protests, there's still a strong desire to not allow people to be outside to film. And that's scarier than saying we can't have protests. Is you can't have protests and they can't be filmed, so you can't see what's happening. And that is Sure, it's chilling saying that we can't have protests. All right, that's a lot, but it's more chilling saying you can't show what happens at these protests. Oh, wow. Okay. That's something that I think anyone, even on the lockdown to zero crowd, would say, no, we need to see what's happening in these protests. So that's absolutely what I want.
If the government was able to give you a peaceful, happy life, but you had no say in what you did, but everything they chose for you made you happy, but you had no freedom to determine your own course. Is that something that you think that you would be content with?
I think it's what a lot of Australians already have. So, like America and your paycheck protection program, we rolled out a similar level of social welfare. Businesses are being granted $20,000 to $50,000. Jobs were being furloughed and paid for. We're handing people direct checks if they get a COVID test and you got to self isolate. We're handing them 280 US dollars just to cover them while they're not able to do work or what have you. I think we're already there. Um, we just don't know it.
But
And
you
if I can
personally,
share
for
another,
your experience, you personally, whether
oh,
you're
me
there
personally,
or if you were there, would you, as a human being traveling through the human existence, if you were able to be put into a situation where the government made everything just you're happy all the time, they provide you everything you need, you don't get to make any choices unless it's a choice that agrees with what they give you. If you were to, would you be willing to say trade freedom of determination for self-determination for happiness?
something I've learned a long time ago is happiness is an outcome, not a destination. So for the government to make me happy would make me very skeptical indeed. I'm skeptical of most things that make me happy. So if you're looking for a yes or no, which I think you're looking for is no, um, which puts me on the more libertarian slant of being able to do this. After all, I'm someone who, despite what many would want, am still going to these protests to film them, and that makes a lot of people unhappy. That already puts me on the libertarian side of things. Does that make me a libertarian? That's not really my job to kind of hoist my flag up and say that. But I do want to be able to go to these protests, and if people want to brand me as that, I'm perfectly happy to do so because these protests should be filmed.
It's just interesting the way you describe Australia right now. It sounds like the majority of the population is very, very docile, and their freedoms are being taken away to the point that they're basically on house arrest. But it doesn't seem, from what you're describing, that many people are that upset about it. But on the other hand, we have this image in America of Australians as being pretty hardy people, and you have all the dangerous animals. I just watched a video the other day where this guy was out surfing, and this terrifying snake monster swam up to him and like put his head on the surfboard and checked him out. And the guy was just like, "Shoo, shoo, get away!" And it looked pretty creepy. And then you've got like the characterization of Australians and things like Crocodile Dundee, to where he's this guy can handle the bush and he's his own man and nobody's going to tell him. But I gotta say that the things I'm seeing, the videos I'm seeing out of Australia are just they terrify me. It's just a 1984 police state. Like I saw a video that looked like it was in a subway station or something, some kind of underground tiled place with stairs coming up, and there were dozens of police officers in what looked like motorcycle helmets, and they were physically arresting people by force and beating anybody that didn't comply, like very, very severely. And I, it just it's bewildering me that this idea of these rugged Australians that I've thought of my whole life, and then seeing what Australians are allowing to happen in their country right now, the level of just average citizens being manhandled by the government there is honestly terrifying.
Our perceptions of how things are tend to be out of date. Just like I was saying about the grocery store, I'm happier thinking that it's the way it was. I don't need to remind myself that it changed. Australia has changed rapidly. the highest rate of migration in the Western world. That changes a place. The hard-working, rugged, rural Australians that you're speaking of, they're either retired or dead. And it's not just your perception that's a little bit out of date, it's ours too. Uh, of the time that you're thinking of with Crocodile Dundee, 1 or 2 when it came out, Sydney was less than 3 million people. It's now 5.5. It's close to doubled since then. The people have changed and their values with them. We are no longer a frontier colony trying to settle a very difficult land that's untamed with no infrastructure. That's been done, and we've built an amazing city on the harbour here, same in Melbourne. And one of our biggest exports, rather than agriculture, is now number one, mining, digging rocks out of the ground, and number two, international students. So we bring other people's kids over here and educate them. This changes a country from working the land on farming is a very different value set from either mining or banking or international students. Very different people than that now, especially in Sydney, especially who hold the power. The rural Australians still are who you expect them to be. They have not changed from what your expectation is, but they're a smaller proportion of the wealth, the land, and the proportion of population. We've changed.
What's the sentiment of the protesters on the ground when you go out to these? What if they've talked to you? What is their feeling about all this? What are they thinking? What are they planning?
So there are the more extreme ones that get into a lot of unproven science. So there's them. Then there's the group that get into the globalist conspiracies, who believe that this is part of a plan to enforce a global law and order on Australia, which is something to that as well. And they're quite broad. Moving on from that, there's the ones who are concerned about the medical implications of taking something that's untested. I hear that all the time, and that's very common. There's also the ones that, regardless of untested or the medicine behind it, who are deeply concerned about being told that they must do something. And that's actually a big proportion. That's where we're coming towards the center of this movement of, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a vitamin D tablet or some kind of syrup, or it could just whatever it is. Being told you must do something alarms them. And that's where we get to more of the center of this movement of mandated anything. Many of them ask why, and it's something that I try and challenge now the center left of. Can this group wait just a little bit? Can I wait just a little bit? Can people wait just a little bit longer? A month, 2 months, is this okay? What about 3 months? And inevitably the response is no, this must change now. You must take, because we have options of AstraZeneca or Pfizer, and AstraZeneca has more complications for people who are under 40, who what medical officers say are less likely to suffer injury or death from the coronavirus, are being told to take AstraZeneca, which has a higher rate of, our health officers say, a higher rate of complication. And that leads to confusion in society, which turns into anger when they feel that the information they're given just isn't true. And there's the final group of people which are just out to party, who just want to punch on, who are just there to riot, who've been locked down for months. You saw this last year in your country, who just have had enough of being at home and just want to get out and cause some damage. There's a good cross section of what our lockdown protests look like.
What do you see? Do you have any feelings that you're able to predict what's going to happen in the near future in Australia?
It has been a big 5 weeks now since our big freedom riot. And it did degenerate into a riot. To begin, in large parts of it was peaceful, it was wonderful, but you can't ignore the violence as well. Throwing glass bottles at officers and guys, officers holding their head as blood's coming out of them. It's tough to see. Protesters were hurt too, but it's a change from what used to be and it has been a year. If I can take you back a year for what protests used to look like, they were wonderful. They were these happy sits in the park a year ago, where they'd bring flags and just talk about what their cause is, and it was cheery. It doesn't look like this now, both because the restrictions have increased and the police response has as well. So where we go from this time to the next month, it's worrying. People are being told they can't leave their homes to earn to earn money. We have different ethnic groups that are about saying this is persecution of the Muslim community of Sydney or the Hindi community of Sydney. We have our more wealthy white eastern suburbs groups saying that this is a medical apartheid. And we have a steadily increasing police response, which shuts down train stations, not cuts bridges, but blockades bridges and highways, searches cars, boots and bonnets open, looking for protesters. And we have a political support for all of these actions, and no one is willing to negotiate. The anti-lockdowners aren't willing to negotiate. The police aren't willing to negotiate. The politicians don't want to look like they're on the wrong angle. I think they're going. The anti-lockdowners are going to lose some steam on the protest in 2 weeks, and they don't have the energy to continue because simply we've seen up close to 1,000 arrests now, almost 10,000 fines, and some of these fines are $5,000 and up. This is big money. So some of the most devout guys are having the energy and sales taken out of them, but it's leaving behind the protesters, which are the most determined, which no matter how many fines, no matter how many arrests, no matter how much you throw them in jail. So the most determined are going to be left. I think they're going to lose some energy, and I just predict at this point more violence.
Yeah. You spoke about police getting hit in the heads with bottles. I'm not one for just indiscriminate violence, but I know that a lot of people would argue that if these police are agreeing to follow orders and lock people in their houses and take people's freedoms away, that that's maybe the right response to that.
So the right response to police doing this is to...
I'm saying that there are a lot of people that would boldly say that if police are agreeing to take people's freedoms and lock them in their homes, that the right response is protesters attacking them physically. From my perspective, they're acting like tyrants. They're taking people's freedoms away, literally putting people on house arrest for a potential risk.
Something I always try and remind my viewers of is the police are a blunt implement. Police follow orders. Police minister says, lock down the city, maintain order. So yes, sir. What the police do and the policies they follow come from the politicians. And the politicians are very closely watching public opinion. So the tyrants very much are the politicians implementing this. They could resist the women at times hysteria that we're having here, and much of it is absolute hysteria at points. They could resist that and say, let's just wait just a little bit. But the strength of the public opinion is very strong. The police could resist some of it, and I will say this of the police that I do speak with, because I have to try and maintain good relationships wherever I can. You smile, you nod, and you treat them with respect because they are people who have families as well. They're struggling to enforce this as well. They're hoping that they don't need to be doing this. But if they don't enforce it, they get fired. They've been embarrassed by the sheer turnout that there has been. And I've spoken with some of the officers. They didn't expect some of the violence that happened because many of these protests, like I was showing you earlier, were quite calm, happy family affairs. This is what they expected at some of these protests. And what they got was something deeply different. If I can show you what happens over at this one instead, is that instead they approach. This is a journalist working for KUTV, one of your large media, at a large media organization here, and they go up to him. And this journalist shocked me the way that he tries to egg them on, and then ends up getting in a fight. They weren't expecting this kind of police weren't expecting this response, and the police respond to violence in the only way they know how to: more violence.
Well,
So you
I've
get
also
a
seen videos, and I'm pretty sure it was from Australia, to where there was a peaceful demonstration in a park, and the police came running in, kicking people and hitting people with batons. And um, is that not a true situation that's happened?
oh, Melbourne, yeah, okay. Now Melbourne is a completely different situation. As I was mentioning earlier, if Melbourne will start the day in hard gear, so batons, shields, helmets, you cannot see their faces. You cannot they are showing up saying we are ready to fight. I'm confident we've got boys in hard gear in reserves, but New South Wales, Sydney police are not deploying them frontline. They're waiting to see if things escalate from that. Which, in terms of crowd response, you don't show up to a peaceful crowd with hard gear up front, which is exactly what, for whatever reason, Melbourne, Victoria, is doing that. Fairly picnicky crowd, but showing up with hard gear ready for the belters. Sensible policing is just getting lost down there, and they're deploying pepper spray without limits. They're not letting the protesters try and march in a direction. They're deploying everything they can. And yes, that is happening, and it is shocking. And yeah, it's worse than anything I ever saw in some of your BLM riots, even. It's the same response that the media gave President Trump a belting for when he cleared the square out in front of the church. That's what that kind of response, rather than slowly pushing forward, is what's happening in Melbourne all the time. And that is something that the police are accountable for.
Well, you touched on the idea that police officers aren't. You touched on the I'm following orders thing,
Yeah.
and I'm seeing that rise up again. And it seems to go hand in hand with authoritarianism. Um, the human civilization, for the first time after the World War II in the Nuremberg trials, that we had collectively decided that that's no longer an excuse for individuals. You can no longer claim moral unaccountability because you were following orders of higher up. And you talked about the politicians being the tyrants, but the politicians have no power alone unless people agree to follow their orders. And
That's true.
uh, I see this on two sides. In leftist areas, like Portland in the northwest of the U.S., you're seeing officers agree to stand down, and they're watching crimes happening, and they're just allowing it, and they're complicitly allowing these things to happen. But then I'm seeing in more authoritarian areas like Germany, Australia, England, where police are coming in and they're following orders by actively following them and being brutal. And um, I just I think this has been dealt with already. This philosophical question of whether somebody can get away with saying that I was following orders and there's no personal moral culpability for that. Um, I think that's ludicrous, and it's why we're getting into these situations, because people are agreeing to just follow orders. And the idea that a police officer can say that, like, oh well, I'm excused for doing this bad thing that I felt like I didn't want to do it, but I had to do it, but I'm following orders, and I have a paycheck, and I have a mortgage, and I have a family. To me, that's no different than talking to a cartel member that's killing people and to sell drugs and saying, like, well, I have a mortgage and I have children, and this is how I feed them. Um, Either it's morally acceptable or it's not. It doesn't matter what you're doing with the proceeds from your actions. If it's an immoral act, then you shouldn't be doing it. If the police are following orders from a quote unquote tyrant politician, they are themselves tyrants. They're in choosing to engage in that. So I just all these authoritarian states that are coming up, whether it's allowing criminals to go wild or whether it's bashing and beating random citizens that are just standing up for the freedom. I think it's all hinged on this idea that you can excuse yourself from your personal actions by just saying, "Well, I was told to do that."
I'm going to pluck out one part of that, which is the example of Portland, and the mayor and city council there issued a policy for police to broadly not defund, but to stand back and stand by, to coin a phrase. It wasn't the commissioner alone that made that decision. It's always more than one piece acting together. The police response in Australia was not just the commissioner, was not just the minister, was not just the premier, and was not just the people, and wasn't just superintendents and all these things. It's all of them who tend to influence each other. There is a societal demand for, and there is a clamoring for more of an authoritarian response. The Daily Mail article this week was filled with comments demanding that even if I broke no laws and had no fines, which I didn't, demanded that I be locked up for not obeying the spirit of the laws. And the politicians listened to that, just as in Portland, the same happens. And the morality broadly through history is secondary to who wins. Winners legislate. Purists tend to be impotent. And that's a quote from one of our former Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, that morality tends to be subjective to who wins elections. And certainly what we saw in World War II, going back to Nuremberg there, winners determined what was moral and not. The losers' morality was not.
You can say that winners determine what is the current mores of society. You can say that winners determine the status quo of society, what's taboo, the social window of what's acceptable. But morality is not something that is determined by conquest or might.
Increasingly, at least in Australia, we're finding it does tend to be not through physical conflict, but through social conflict, through commentary and shunning. Because we're not face to face with each other anymore, we're using social media as a way to communicate with each other, and we're learning new ways to discover what is right and wrong and what we can enforce on others. Much of our the tyranny of the majority tends to be what is happening, and those most confident to do so are doing so. A good example was one of our protests recently, our larger protests on the 24th, the one that you would have seen that was the largest and most violent. Many government departments wrote to their staff asking for them to report on which of their fellow employees they understood may have attended. This was, shockingly, this was the employers asking employees to dob on each other, not anything else. Even small private companies. We are discovering a new morality down here, and it's different from what we're used to.
Sounds a lot like 1984, more and more.
Well, I was born in 84, so it's there. What we are drawing from is some woke ideology to build it, and the technology is enabling the success of it. Facial recognition is being used to identify protesters, as they are in your country as well. And we're using them to identify those who are anti-lockdown protests, scanning Facebook pages. We have a partnership here between police and Facebook to do that. And it's, for much of society, exciting and to go into, to see this. And for others, it's terrifying, exactly what it is, 1984. We're trying to work out what is right and wrong now. And increasingly, the threat of a deadly virus is used as a justification for anything, because what is more justifiable than death? It's a very, very confronting time for everyone.
Interesting.
I can see you're taking it in there. You're trying to when you have 100+ days to get used to it every day, it becomes normal. And whether you want it or not, it is our new normal. And I try and remind my viewers, if you don't like some of the things that you're seeing, I'll honestly report what's happening. If you don't like what you're seeing, you'll need to convince your fellow man first that this is something different. Punching a police officer in the face will not change a thing. It will just you will just end up in jail. But if you convince your friend, your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your mother, if you talk to them and use dialogue, you won't need to use violence, because dialogue is the last resort before you need to use violence to convince someone of your views. Speak to them. So if anyone here is in Australia saying, speak to your neighbor about this. Do you want this? Is this the future you want? If it is, well, great, we're here. If it's not, well, you might need to get to work about changing that, because this is our new status quo.
It is very unsettling to hear you word it that way. You sound like the frog that's being boiled in the pot and just saying, well, this is how it is.
I've just seen, I guess you could say that I have seen the series of frogs that have been boiled, with the numbers of arrests, which total over 1,000. We seem to be so afraid of the thing happening, but the thing has happened. This is not a fear of a new kind of morality, a fear of a new kind of policing. It has happened. In fact, we've been living it for over a year, yet everyone is still saying, oh, what if this happens? It has happened, and yet we still cannot accept it has happened. Until we accept this thing has occurred, we'll still be left out of date. So that's part of my job, is to say, we're here now. This is new. Do you want to change this and go forward to an alternate future, rather than refusing to accept this is our reality as of today? I can't believe some of the protests I see there in the US against mandates, which flying American flags by the side of roads, people having a nice, peaceful, good time. We don't have any of that. We've kind of accepted that we're in it.
Scary, man. It sounds just like I keep saying it, the book 1984, people just started loving Big Brother and just giving up their own autonomy and their own will to thrive and determine their own course through life. Sounds like the majority of Australians are enjoying their gilded cage.
There's truth to some of what you said there. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we're there. We got there, and now it's up to decide what we do once we, as our premier hopes, reach 70% vaccination and things begin to open. What will our future lead from there? We're at 38%, so we've got a long way to go for another month or so. We've got to decide where our new future is. Do we want more of this or something different? We'll find out.
What do you want?
Oh, what do I want? First and foremost, I want to be able to cover protests. If I can't cover protests, or if someone who's been covering protests for 2 years cannot cover protests, it is a closed door to anyone new, except that gets approved by large corporate media. And then that's it. Only Pravda and Vestia can report the news. Only certain large billion-dollar corporations are allowed to report what's happening, and they will skew it to, as corporations do, to what their bottom line is. And we'll need to accept a world
which is as far as the state of your society and the lockdowns and the government control, what do you want?
Separate to being able to report protests, what do I want?
All the things that you're speaking of. You keep saying we, as though you're speaking for the society. We need to do this. We need to do that. We should do that. What do you want? What are your personal opinions? What are your desires? Are you fine with the lockdowns? Do you want them to end? Do you want to stay inside till nobody ever dies again?
I think staying inside till nobody ever dies again is a impossible goal, and I would not want to spend a lot of time in a society that's hoping to do that.
Well,
I
obviously,
think
I was
that
being
should say a
facetious.
lot.
Well, I was being facetious on that. Like, obviously, that's a troll on the extreme left wing people that are putting safety above everything, because it's ludicrous to think that we're going to stop and remove all threats. So, what would you like to see?
It, I try not to create too many messages on what people should do, but
I'm
I
not
will
asking
say I
what
would
other
not
people
want
should
to
do. I'm asking what you want.
So what I think it should be a clear enough message that I would not want to live in a society, and I would seek to change the society I'm living in if its policy were to lock down forever or to zero. That just isn't a future I would want me or the people I care about to spend time in, because it's there are better ways to live than that. There is risk in the world, and somewhere in the middle is the ideal society I want, not a complete. It's always the extremes in society which I've found to be the worst. And I've lived around the world. Somewhere in the middle, the shades of balance and nuance. Sharing a society with like-minded people is important to me, and increasingly I'm finding it difficult to, even as someone who just wants to go and cover protests, getting increasingly shunned by people around me within my neighborhood. And that's okay, but I'll need to find a future where I can find people like me who would support things that I do. And whether that's still here or not, I think that should be a clear enough message that if I'm considering where I want to live, that would be a big change.
Did Australia start the lockdowns with the idea of 2 weeks to flatten the curve?
I think our tagline was 3 weeks, and that was the idea. March 24 in 2020. And at that time, we didn't know what was going on. We were very concerned. We got it ahead of you because we are so close to China, and we have about 3 or 4% of our population are Chinese citizens. So a big part of that, going backwards and forwards with Wuhan, and that was the hope that it was just a few weeks to flatten the curve. We're a long way past that now.
Yes. So, isn't it reasonable when you talk about not wanting it to last forever? If 2 weeks or 3 weeks turned into 18 months so far, with as far as I can tell, and I'll show you, there's no end in sight necessarily. Do you think it's irrational to think that this might be turning into a permanent situation?
No. I know that's I can expand on that if you want. This is when I say this is our new normal, it is. This is a permanent situation. Most societal, governmental, regulatory, all of these policies that until someone works about changing them, they are permanent. So the standards that we live in right now, which I think Melbourne has said that they're wanting low double-digit cases. So I infer that to mean anywhere between 10 and 30 cases per day in a 5.5 million person city. That is their standard that they've been living with for 2 years. That's a long time. That's longer than our involvement in the Korean War. This should mean something, that this is going to be the way it is for years to come until there is a change in opinion and or politics.
All right. Is there anything else that is on your mind about Americans might find prevalent to hear about the goings on in Australia right now?
Times change. They have changed for us. America made a different decision to what Australia did. You decided that you couldn't live like that forever, and you took a different path. Some states are shades of different, but Australia, we're continuing to try and fight to see if we can go back to the way things were before, and we haven't yet accepted the new normal, which is that there is a virus, and we'll need to find a way to live with that. But we're hoping against hope that we'll never need to. We're hoping against hope that if we have QR code check-ins at every store, if we have mandatory vaccine checks, if we have lockdowns, if virus case is too big, that this will be, as many people hope, if we get enough people vaccinated, everything will go back to normal. But one thing I've noticed is there is no reverse gear on history, only forward. And until we change the direction of whichever that way might be, if you want a zero case future, or you want an ability to try and have and thrive in a life, or you fear the risk, you've got to decide. And there's upsides and downsides to all. Try and get the truth, because that's the most important one that matters.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you for letting me interview Chris. Hopefully you guys are let out of your house prisons soon. I wish that for you. And goodbye.
Thanks, Willen, and I hope to have you on my show very soon. You in?
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks, man. Talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.
All right.
And again, if there's anybody that wants to reach out to me and provide me an interview, I'm looking for personal on-the-ground experiences of COVID around the world and what the lockdowns are like. I'd really like to speak to a police officer about the how they're having to handle the unrest in different parts of the world. If there's anything else you think culturally relevant, I would love to interview you. Please reach out at thevillainreport@gmail.com. Thank you.